Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this video and this little topic that I found to be very particularly interesting. Anyways, of course, for those of you that have been around my channel for quite a while, or for those of you that have been around it most recently, a lot of the times on this channel, mainly, probably about 90% of the time, I usually tend to talk about that of boxing topics every once in a while, also that of an MMA fight because combat sports, as I've said before, they usually are my main forte, as my name, of course, gives it away, boxing realist. But of course, every once in a while, I also will talk about a sport that I very thoroughly enjoy to watch. That could be NBA basketball, it could be NFL football, but probably my second most favorite sport to watch, other than that of combat sports, is that of professional tennis or that of the ATP circuit. And there's been really a lot of talent within that of the tennis circuit, in my view, especially throughout that 2010s era. Now, of course, when you talk about the quote unquote big three, of course, you had Roger Federer, who kind of dominated throughout that early to mid to late 2000s era, and of course, was still able to capture some titles in the 2010s era. But that was really when Novak Djokovic was able to take over, especially ever since that 2011 year. And time pretty much never looked back. Novak Djokovic clearly was the most dominant tennis player throughout that era, at least for that of the men's tennis circuit. Rafael Nadal, of course, the Spaniard, he also had a decent amount of success throughout that of the 2000s and also throughout that of the 2010s. And then, of course, you had the big arguments known as the Big Three and who was the greatest out of all of them. And of course, each and every single one of them, they all had a little bit of a debate of who was above the other, whether it be all time titles or Grand Slams or days of number one or a certain amount of other things, the ATP finals, Olympics, whatever it may be. But I think that after a while, especially after this year, especially knowing now that Roger Federer has retired, I believe that as of last year or earlier this year, I can't really remember. And Rafael Nadal, it looks like he's pretty much at the end of his rope. It looks like he's pretty much near, very near the end of his career. And he may win one more title possibly, but I'm not sure if he's even going to win one more. Anyways, the point being is that Novak Djokovic right now, the fact that he has 23 Grand Slams, the fact that he pretty much leads both of them in pretty much every major statistic, including that of Grand Slams, most amount of weeks and days at number one, I believe. The most amount of ATP finals, he's tied with that of Roger Federer. Point is that Novak Djokovic pretty much leads them in every major statistic. He had the highest peak out of all of them, out of the big three. And on top of that, he has a winning head to head record over both of them, and he has more Grand Slams. So, once again, I just don't think that you can really debate anything else at this point. I think that you would have to clearly debate that Novak Djokovic is clearly the greater out of both of them, or out of all three of them, out of that little trio. But the real question also is now is that between that of Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, because both of their careers, in my view, they are very comparable. Who is truly the greater player between that of Rafael Nadal and that of Roger Federer? And I think that, to be honest with you, that a little bit ago that I thought that it would have clearly been Nadal because he has the winning head-to-head record over that of Roger Federer. Of course, he also has the advantage in certain Grand Slam matchups, and it's not like it just happened in the Roland Garros because Rafael Nadal has also beat him in the Wimbledon. He has also beat him, I believe, in the Australian Open. Now, I don't think that Rafael Nadal is necessarily the better all-around player on either of those tournaments, in either the Wimbledon or the Australian Open. But the fact does reside, the fact does remain that he has beaten Roger Federer there before. And Novak Djokovic has been a decent amount more dominant against that of Rafael Nadal, usually on that of other surfaces, at least usually, especially on that of hard courts. But anyways, Roger Federer, of course, he certainly does have debate over Rafael Nadal because he does have certain statistics over that of Rafael Nadal. And on top of that, the championships, they are comparable. It's not like they are windows apart. And of course, Djokovic is not windows apart from them either. But like I've always said, in my view, Rafael Nadal is really only a 21-time Grand Slam champion. I don't really count that 22nd one that he got in 2022 in the Australian Open where they banned Novak Djokovic for the COVID-19 vaccine. I'm sorry, I just don't count that one in the little politics that they were playing, but it is what it is. Anyways, this channel, I believe, goes by the name of Goatkovic. Of course, a Novak Djokovic fan. So, you may have to take some of what he says with a little bit of a grain of salt, but we're going to see what he has to say. He brought up a lot of good points in my view about who debatably could be the better player. There's going to be several points that he brings up. I'm going to bring up, to the best of my knowledge, the points that I remember as well, and we're going to have a debate about who debatably is that of the better player. But anyways, let's get into it. Let's see what they have to say.
In a previous video, we compared the big three through the lens of the 5 most important tennis records. And it was obvious that Djokovic is the greatest because he owns all 5.
The man doesn't even have a 0 for Rafael Nadal. He has a donut. And for those of you that don't know, Rafael Nadal, he's never won an ATP finals, which of course a lot would count against him, and I would probably count against him a little bit as well, because the ATP finals, it's not necessarily as important as the Grand Slams, but it is probably the second most important tournament of the year, at least debatably, and the fact that he's never even won one of those, it is a little bit alarming.
Of them. However, if we compare only Federer and Nadal, at first glance, things are not so clear. It appears that they are evenly matched, and both fan bases could make a case why their favorite is better. But this is only an illusion. In this video, we will take a deeper dive into each of these records, and you will see why Federer is greater than Nadal. Let's get into it. The biggest bragging right that Nadal fans have over Federer supporters is the Grand Slam count. It seems irrefutable because 21 plus asterisk is more than 20. But there is another way to look at
21 plus asterisk. But I agree with the man completely. It is 21 plus an asterisk because, once again, I do not count that Grand Slam title. I just personally don't. If Roger Federer or Novak Djokovic were banned during that of the Wimbledon and only Rafael Nadal was willing to play, like, for example, if Roger Federer, whenever he won the Wimbledon title last, I can't necessarily remember. Maybe it was in, in 2017, I think he won the Australian Open, I believe. I can't remember. I'm not sure if he won the Wimbledon that year. Maybe he did. I can't remember. But anyways, the last time that he won the Wimbledon, if Roger Federer was banned from that tournament because of an alleged vaccine that, the disease or an illness that pretty much had been going on for a couple years prior anyway, and all of a sudden they just banned him pretty much out of nowhere, no Roger Federer fan would be counting that Wimbledon title that Rafael Nadal won overall on that surface. And in my view, they would have the right to believe that, and that's why I do not count that second Australian Open title that Rafael Nadal got. There's no way that you're going to sit here and tell me that overall that there's not a little bit of an asterisk next to that when you're talking about the greatest player of this generation, debatably of all time, and on top of that, clearly the best at the Australian Open. They banned him from that surface because of a vaccine issue, and then overall, I'm just going to count that title in fullness. I'm sorry, I just can't do that.
While Nadal has more titles overall, Federer is better than him in 3 of the 4 slams. Federer has more Australian Opens, Wimbledons, and US Opens, while Nadal only has more Roland Garros titles. Nadal fans will insist that only the total matters, but that's deceptive. Just because he stat padded in one tournament doesn't make Nadal better. It makes him more specialized. His fans will surely say that this is unfair to Nadal because there is only one clay slam. But that's a lame argument for many different reasons, which I will cover in another video. The next biggest tournament...
Well, listen, before the man continues onwards, and the first debate basically is that Roger Federer is more complete on other surfaces than that of Rafael Nadal. And I would tend to agree with that, but it's not really as apparent as what it is in my view as what it would be in the Novak Djokovic conversation. Now, it's still apparent that Roger Federer is probably the more complete player on the majority of surfaces versus that of Rafael Nadal. But the problem also is with Roger Federer, and I've also stated this when it comes down to it, Roger Federer has lost to Rafael Nadal in important tournaments before, not even just on clay. He's lost to him, I believe, in the Wimbledon once or twice. Certainly that one time, I believe it was either in the 2008 or 2009 year. I can't remember, but I think it was in 2009. If I'm wrong about that, someone correct me. But one of those 2 years, I believe, Rafael Nadal ended up beating Roger Federer in that of the Wimbledon final. Novak Djokovic, at the peak of his powers, never would have lost to Rafael Nadal in a Wimbledon final. Now, of course, they were pushed to 5 sets, I believe, all the way back in 2018. Also, keep in mind that that match was split up in 2 days, and that Rafael Nadal had a little bit of time to properly physically recover and adapt. So, once again, when it comes down to it, it's not like Roger Federer has never, it's not like Rafael Nadal has never beat Roger Federer in some of those Grand Slams. He actually beat Roger Federer, I believe, 3-1 in that of the Australian Open. And he also beat him in the Wimbledon, I believe, once or twice. He also beat him in the Indian Wells tournament, I believe, twice in his career as well. So once again, it's not like Rafael Nadal never beat him, or overall, it's not like with the Novak Djokovic situation where I believe I've seen a statistic where Rafael Nadal, he didn't even win a single set on hard court over Novak Djokovic for the past 10 years.
After Grand Slams is the ATP Finals, where Federer has 6 titles and Nadal symbolically has none. In other words, Federer is better in 4 of the 5 most important tournaments, and Nadal didn't even win all of them. Here's a fun fact. Roger is not the only player who is better than Nadal in 4 of the 5 biggest events. Sampras also has more titles in Australia, Wimbledon, US Open, and ATP Finals. The third most important.
Let me also state this before he continues. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of tennis historians who debatably may not even have Rafael Nadal on the same level as a Pete Sampras or someone overall like a Rod Laver or a Bjorn Borg. They may not even have him on that level because they may believe that those players, for their era, that they were debatably the more complete players. And you could have a great argument for that. Now, would I necessarily put either of those players above Rafael Nadal for the greatest of all time debate? I would have to do a little bit more research, and I'm not quite sure if I would go that far, but I understand people's opinions. Because once again, this is a longevity era. This is not the era of the 1980s or the 1990s or even the early 2000s where people ended up pretty much retiring at around the age of 31. Like I said, that era really did not come about until Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal, they were pretty much around. And you notice that a lot of guys, almost no matter what the sport is today, that the longevity is usually a bit longer. That's why LeBron James, he can play till he's about 38 to 40 years old. He's lasted 20 seasons, while, players in the NBA back in the 80s and some of the 90s, a lot of the times they only lasted sometimes 13 seasons at max. Now, there was a few here and there that lasted maybe 20 seasons, but not very many. It was not the standard. Of course, in the NFL today, you look at Tom Brady, he was able to last, I believe, all the way until he was about really almost age 45. So depending on the rules, depending on the supplements, and also depending on certain sports, the PEDs, let's also be real, certain athletes can last a lot longer today. So you also must understand that the eras were different.
Tournaments are Masters 1000, in which Nadal holds a 36 to 28 advantage over Roger. But just like in slams, Nadal only has a bigger total, while Federer is better in more different tournaments. Federer has more titles than Nadal in 6 Masters, while Nadal has the advantage in only 4, the 3 clay events and Canadian Open. Furthermore, Roger is missing only 2 Masters trophies from his collection, while Nadal never won 3 of them. As you can see, there is a pattern when we compare their big titles. Nadal has more slams, more masters, and more big titles overall. But Federer is better in more different slams, more different masters, and has won 6 ATP finals to Nadal's 0. Roger has more titles than Nadal in 9 of the 14 big events. The only reason why Nadal has more trophies overall is that he compensated heavily on clay. Nadal won 40 of his 57 big titles on clay. Less than 30% of big tournaments are on clay, but Nadal won 70% of his trophies on that surface. His fans will throw a tantrum when I say this, but Nadal is a clay specialist. Nadal fans will retaliate by saying that Federer won most of his titles on hard courts. But guys, that's because most big titles are on hard courts. And even more importantly, Roger...
Before the man speaks again, and he brings up a very good point, which is that Nadal is somewhat of a specialist on clay. Listen, you can kind of take a look at that in 2 ways. You can kind of take a look at it and say that Rafael Nadal, because it is a double-edged sword, that he is more limited on 2 of the other surfaces, at least the main surfaces, that being on grass and that of hard court, which he is. There's no doubt about it. But one also could take a look at it and say that Rafael Nadal that he probably is the most dominant player of all time when he gets on his favorite surface. One could legitimately debate that because there was no more dominant player, debatably of the generation, than when Rafael Nadal was that on the clay surface. That's the thing about Rafael Nadal that, could maybe debate him. I'm not going to say necessarily over Djokovic, but if you were to debate him as the greatest of all time because of what he's been able to do on clay, I would somewhat get it. Now, unfortunately for him, it is going to go down that he was limited on that of other surfaces. And the fact that Djokovic especially was able to be so dominant on him, especially in the past 10 years of that on hard courts, it is going to look a little bit worse on that of Rafael Nadal. What also is important to mention, and this would probably go more for that of Roger Federer, I believe if you look up both of their career winning percentages on all the three main surfaces, I think that Roger Federer has 80 something percent on both hard court and grass, and I think that he has about 79% on that of clay. Novak Djokovic has 80% in every single surface, which is the most consistent all around balanced percentages out of any of the three, probably out of any of the players that I've ever seen within that of tennis history, which once again is another great argument to why Novak Djokovic is that of the greatest player of all time, at least certainly of his generation. I really don't even think that there's a doubt that he's the greatest player of his generation in terms of the men's circuit. But anyways, when it comes down to it, also with Roger Federer, well, I already mentioned him, but Rafael Nadal, I believe that he has a 90% winning percentage within that of the clay. So he has the highest percentage out of all three of them on his most dominant surface. But also, where it becomes a problem is that in the other two surfaces on hard court and grass court, I believe that he does not even have an 80% winning percentage. If I'm wrong about that, someone corrects me. But, like I said, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. There's positives and there's negatives with it. But one could argue that it's a little bit more of a negative because it is very clear that Rafael Nadal, yes, he is a little bit more of a specialist on that of clay.
He's not a one surface.
And like I've already stated in the past, especially when talking about Novak Djokovic is first, in my personal view, out of two of those surfaces of his generation. He's probably the best grass court player that I've personally ever seen. He's also the greatest hard court player that I've ever seen, especially on that of the faster hard courts. On clay, he would probably be second. With Rafael Nadal, he certainly would be first on clay, but on hard court and grass, he would be third. The thing is about Novak Djokovic, like I said, what makes him debatably the greatest player of all time, and certainly the greatest of his generation, is that out of the big three, he is not third on any of those surfaces. Rafael Nadal, of course, the thing is with him is that he is first in one of those categories, but he's also third in two other categories. The thing is with Roger Federer is that he's not first, in my view, at least definitively in any of those categories. But he's also he's also third on clay. But he's also a guy to where you could debate that him and Nadal, they have a similar amount of points. So that's why overall they're about even, because if we were going to go from a point scale, and if we were going to go from 3-1 or 1-3, and if we were going to say whoever gets first in that category gets 3 points, Novak Djokovic, he would be first in that of grass, so 3 points. He'd be first in that of hard court, and he'd be second in clay. So in total, that would be 8 points, because you get 2 points for that of second place. Third place, of course, 1 point. So that means Rafael Nadal, first place, he gets 3 points in that of clay. And then in that of the other two surfaces, he only gets 2 extra points because he's third in the rest of them. So that'd be 5 points. But for Roger Federer, he gets 2 points for grass, 2 points for hard court, and 1 for clay. So that would mean that Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer, in terms of that, you could debate that they're pretty much neck and neck. Now, once again, Roger Federer, he probably is the more complete player on clay. Or excuse me, not on clay, but he's the more complete player, all around. But on clay, Rafael Nadal, he's probably more dominant, debatably, than what Roger Federer has really ever been on any surface. At least one could debate. Now, of course, he was very dominant in the Wimbledon, but once there really started being main challenges there, especially that of Novak Djokovic, he never really beat Novak Djokovic in that of the big spots.
Wonder like Nadal. When we look at the win percentages on different surfaces.
Because one thing I'll give Rafael Nadal is this: even when Novak Djokovic was at the peak of his powers, even Novak Djokovic a lot of the times could not compete with that of Rafael Nadal on clay. Kind of like how Rafael Nadal could not really usually compete with him in the Australian Open. Now, if anyone gave him the best fight possible, it usually was Novak Djokovic. But, that's one thing I'll say about that. Roger Federer, many people claim that his best surface is that of the Wimbledon, but he lost to Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic multiple times. And he actually has a losing record, I believe 3-1 to Novak Djokovic in that of the Wimbledon. And he never beat him in a Wimbledon final, I believe.
We see that on clay, Nadal is the all-time leader and Federer is 14th. But everywhere else, Roger is miles better. On hard courts and grass, Roger is in top 2 of all time, while Nadal is far behind. He is 10th on hard courts and 12th on grass. And Nadal is downright atrocious on indoor hard courts, where he is 43rd on the all-time list. Also,
wow, let's take a look at those statistics again.
Time, while Nadal is far behind. He is 10th on hard courts and 12th on grass. And Nadal is downright atrocious on indoor hard courts.
Now you take a look at these stats here, and once again, they certainly, could be in favor of either player. But that does have to be stated that Nadal, as you can clearly see here, that he clearly is more limited on that of other surfaces. Because it's really even a debate that Rafael Nadal, if we're really truly talking about even grass court or hard court, some people may not even debate him as the third best player on either of those courts. Because truth be told, Andy Murray won 2 Wimbledons at the prime of his career, and Rafael Nadal, he won 2 Wimbledons, but that was kind of before that little era. And don't get me wrong, he had some challenges there like Roger Federer, but one could debate that maybe it wasn't as thick of the cream of the crop as the early 2010s, where you had challengers like Djokovic and Stan Wawrinka and Andy Murray and blah, 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 and other guys. And it's not like Rafael Nadal. It's not like, at times that he did not leave the Wimbledon early. So like I said, you take a look at some of these percentages and, it is a little bit alarming if you were going to debate for Rafael Nadal over Roger Federer, that it seems that he does as poorly as what he does on some of these other surfaces,
where he is 43rd on the all-time list. Also notice that Nadal has a better overall win percentage than Roger, but Federer has a higher win rate on all surfaces except clay. Win percentages in the 4 majors show the same thing. Among the big 3 and Sampras, Nadal has the lowest win percentage in all slams except Roland Garros. And if we add ATP Finals, which many consider as the 5th slam, Nadal has the lowest win percentage in 4 of the 5 biggest events. There are many other stats I could show, but they all tell the same.
Well, let me state this, and back to those stats. Of course, Rafael Nadal, you can say that he has the lowest winning percentage, but if we're also going to bring up Novak Djokovic, and this has been one of the gripes with Novak Djokovic that I've had in the past, or not gripes, I guess, because that kind of makes it sound like it's something that I hate or something. Not necessarily like that, but one of the complaints, I guess, if you're going to complain about Djokovic's resume, is that he's always been an underperformer at the U.S. Open for whatever reason. He lost to Rafael Nadal, I believe, all the way back in 2012 on the hard court. Or if it wasn't in 2012, maybe it was in 2013. I can't remember. I do remember that Rafael Nadal beat him 2-1, I believe, in that of the U.S. Open. So Rafael Nadal, even though he probably wouldn't be the greatest U.S. Open tournament guy, overall, he will not be the greatest at the U.S. Open tournament in history. He does have 4 U.S. Open titles. So, that is something that, is relevant.
Story. Nadal is only better than Roger on clay. I can't imagine that Nadal fans have enjoyed this video so far, but this next thing is really going to get their panties in a twist. Federer's titles are worth more than Nadal's because clay is the surface with the weakest competition. Think about it. Can you name any top player in the last 20 years, other than Nadal, who was a clay specialist? You can't. If we're being honest, the only...
Well, I understand the point that you're trying to make, but at the end of the day, Novak Djokovic and Roger Federer, they were competing there. So at the end of the day, Rafael Nadal still won those titles there. I understand what the man is trying to say. Other than that, of Rafael Nadal, there was not really any other super duper major clay competitors. Now, of course, Stan Wawrinka, he had that excellent final against Novak Djokovic, where he pretty much battered him, I believe, all the way back in 2015. I believe it was in 2015. And Djokovic, of course, he was still very great, but the way that I look at it is that if Rafael Nadal were not there, Novak Djokovic, he probably would have had 5 to 6 Roland Garros titles. That's the way that I look at it, if not possibly even more. So one could take a look at it and say that there maybe was not as many Roland Garros challengers, but was it because the competition was weak for that? Because the same players a lot of the times were playing in the same tournament and that of the Roland Garros as what they were within the other two frameworks within that of the other tournaments. So we do have to give Rafael Nadal that certain amount of credit that he was the most complete player on that of the clay court. Now, I would argue that the clay court very much, suits his game, or that it's much more accustomed to his game, because I don't think that he has the anticipation of that of a Djokovic or a Federer quite as much on that of the faster courts. I think that's why he does a lot better on that of the slower courts, so it gives him more time to save that of points, more for his defensive style on that of the clay courts, and on top of that, so he can use his power and his foot speed, I believe, to his advantage to get his forehand and his winners against you, which of course is not going to work as much on hard courts and grass because they are faster and it's harder to predict a point. But at the end of the day, once again, Rafael Nadal did play against Djokovic and Roger Federer, and he was even dominant over them in that series. So I still have to give Rafael Nadal a lot of credit.
Player who could ever challenge Nadal on clay is Novak, and that's Novak's weakest surface. The fact is that it was harder for Federer to win because all top players are good on hard courts and most of them are good on grass. Not only did Roger face generally tougher opposition on his favorite surfaces, but he had to fight for trophies with Djokovic, undoubtedly the best hard courter that ever lived, and one of the greatest of all time on grass. When we take this,
probably the greatest grass court player that I've personally ever seen, just in my personal view. Other than Andy Murray, I believe all the way back in 2013 or whichever year he defeated Novak Djokovic, I don't think Djokovic has ever lost a Wimbledon final. That shows you how dominant he's truly been.
Into consideration, Nadal's tiny advantage over Roger in slams and big titles is meaningless. Before we talk about weeks at number 1, let's also mention the head-to-head record between Federer and Nadal. Just like in everything else, Nadal has more wins overall, but if we break it down by surface, the illusion evaporates. The overall record is 24-16 in favor of Nadal, but this is only because he has a 14-2 advantage on clay. Roger leads on grass, hard courts, and indoor. Two other things.
I agree with that, and that is a very big advantage Nadal usually has in a lot of these head-to-head little statistics. Like the Novak Djokovic versus Rafael Nadal head-to-head, I believe is 30-29. And one of the points that Rafael Nadal fans will always use is that, like I had this one Rafael Nadal fan, I believe, in my comment section one time saying, well, if you think that Novak Djokovic is that much greater than Rafael Nadal, which he's not that much greater, but in my view, he's clearly about a level ahead, or about a half level to a level ahead, somewhere around there. He's, in my view, clearly the better and the greater player. But one person asked, well, no, Rafael Nadal has the advantage in that of the Grand Slam finals, I believe about 11-7. So, what's up with that? Why overall don't you mention that? And, you can mention that, but there has to be the context behind it. And the context behind it is that Rafael Nadal, and I've already mentioned this, he's a great player, but he makes it to the final so often to Roland Garros and not to the final so often also in other tournaments to the point to where a lot of the times he's not meeting up with Novak Djokovic or Roger Federer either in the final or, in other brackets. A lot of the times he did not meet Novak Djokovic in the Australian Open. They've only faced each other there 2 times. Novak Djokovic was able to win both times. In the Wimbledon, I believe 3 separate times. The first time, I believe, was, in the late 2000s where Djokovic was still trying to find his stride. And then the other 2 times were, I believe, in the 2010s. Novak Djokovic beat him both times. So when we talk about advantages in tournaments, when you talk about the all-around completeness, it's actually Djokovic. Now, in the U.S. Open, and especially the Roland Garros, yeah, Rafael Nadal has the advantage there. But they fought each other like 70% of the time in that of the Roland Garros. That's why the statistics look that way. And it's probably very similar to that of Roger Federer. I believe that they fought each other 16 times on that of clay, as it says here.
Stand out in their rivalry. First, They played a disproportionately high number of matches on clay. Nearly half of their slam matches were in Roland Garros. And second, after 2014, Nadal never beat Federer on hard courts and grass. Roger defeated him 6 consecutive times. Both things are also true for Nadal's rivalry with Novak. They played more than half of their slam matches in Roland Garros, and Nadal didn't win outside of clay since 2013. Novak beat him 9 consecutive times. It is less important if Nadal avoided facing his biggest rivals on their favorite surfaces, or if he simply wasn't good enough to advance far in those tournaments. Either way, it's not a good look.
I think at times it is a little bit of both. And like I said, the reason why Rafael Nadal, in my view, never was over that of Novak Djokovic is because a lot of the times Novak Djokovic, besides maybe that of the U.S. Open at times, and even a lot of the times at the U.S. Open, he would come up either at second place or, very close to it. There's been times where Rafael Nadal, he a lot of the times got eliminated in that of the semifinal to a player that he was someone expected to beat, like that of a Dominic Thiem, who was very dominant at the time. I believe one of the more talented players on tour when he lost to him, I believe, all the way back in 2020 in the Australian Open. And then, of course, a couple years ago against Stefanos Tsitsipas when that Djokovic-Medvedev final happened. And Medvedev actually was able to trash Stefanos Tsitsipas in the semifinal, I believe. And Stefanos Tsitsipas was able to come back down 2-0, I believe, and win the last 3 sets. So one of the things that you also can count against Rafael Nadal is that he, once again, it looks, at least compared to clay, severely limited on that of grass and especially the faster hard courts.
For a wannabe GOAT. The bottom line is that Nadal only has a winning record against Roger because of the clay inflation. Sadly for Rafa,
well, once again, one could certainly debate that, but like I said, it's not like the hard court and the grass is as much of a domination as what it is for the Nadal and Djokovic rivalry. So it is what it is. Because once again, Rafael Nadal has beat him before when they were both at the peak of their powers. The only time Rafael Nadal ever beat Djokovic on grass, I believe, at least in terms of the Wimbledon, was when they were not at the peak of their powers.
A one-trick pony left him with several glaring holes in his resume. His fans are aware of this, which is why they always want to boil down.
And once again, let's not forget that Rafael Nadal has been able to beat him in the Australian Open multiple times, as well as the Indian Wells tournament, which I also believe is a hard court tournament.
The GOAT debate to just one number, but for some reason, they never wanted to be the number that would make the most sense. Weeks at number 1. What better way to figure out who is greater than by who was number 1 longer? Weeks at number 1 is an all-encompassing statistic that includes everything we have discussed and more. Instead of just titles, it also considers other notable results, like finals, semifinals, and so on. It reflects surface versatility and is the ultimate measure of consistency. It is incredibly difficult to become number 1, but it is even harder to remain number 1. It is not a coincidence that Roger is far ahead of Nadal in this key stat. The biggest difference between them is that one was a dominant champion in his own time, and the other a pretender who only sat on the throne in short spurts. Federer defended his titles in US Open and Wimbledon 4 times, and his Australian Open titles twice. Nadal never defended a major title on grass and hard courts. Federer won 2 consecutive ATP finals on 3 different occasions. Nadal never even won ATP finals. Federer has 237 consecutive weeks at number 1. Nadal has 209 in total. Federer finished 4 consecutive seasons as number 1. Nadal could never string 2 consecutive seasons. Federer is the only man other than Djokovic with more than 300 weeks at number 1. Nadal holds the record for most weeks at number 2. Roger is not the greatest of all time, but he belongs to a succession of greats who ruled their own eras. He was what Sampras calls the man. Nadal never was, and no number of clay titles can change that. Federer is far greater than Nadal. Thank you for watching, and I will talk to you soon.
Anyways, that's pretty much about it for the video. I just thought that I would review for that because I thought that it was a very interesting argument. But just kind of to bring up a couple more points, he said that Federer is far more greater than Nadal. I don't think that just in my personal view, that Federer is far greater than Nadal. Now, one could debate that he's greater than Nadal because he probably had the higher peak than that of Rafael Nadal. He had more days at number one. He has more ATP finals, and he's probably more complete on the other surfaces. But one also could argue for Rafael Nadal once again because he clearly was the most dominant player on his favorite surface. At least one certainly could debate. On top of that, he has defeated Roger Federer multiple times, I believe, on that of hard court. Certainly at least once within that of the Wimbledon, possibly even in other tournaments on that of grass. So it's not like Rafael Nadal does not have a certain argument over that of Roger Federer. On top of that, he has surpassed him in Grand Slams, and I'm sure other statistics as well. One also could bring up the gold medal, I believe, that Rafael Nadal has, and the silver medal, I believe, that Roger Federer has. I'm not usually a big fan of bringing up the Olympics, but, if you're going to argue that of Rafael Nadal's case, one certainly could bring it up. But like I said, Roger Federer, all-time great player, but one of the things that I've always had when it comes to the Roger Federer is the greatest of all time argument, especially over that of Novak Djokovic or Rafael Nadal, is that Roger Federer, especially throughout the 2000s, he had a lot of those stats where there really was not any other clear challengers to really threaten him. The only other really clear challenger throughout that of the 2000s was that really of Rafael Nadal. That's why a lot of the times I compare Roger Federer to that of Shaquille O'Neal or that of the Kobe and Shaq Lakers. Like, they were so dominant. Like, Shaquille O'Neal was one of the most dominant forces that you would ever see. And that's why so many people said that Roger Federer at his peak, they had never seen another level like it, because I believe that he had 271 consecutive weeks at that of the number one spot. But who really was there? like those weeks, I believe, came in that of the 2000s. Like, Novak Djokovic had not reached his prime yet. Rafael Nadal was still there, but one could argue that he was even still growing as a player. Like, who else was still there? Like Andy Roddick, that the one-time Grand Slam champion. You can't really even remember anyone else from that generation. That's why I compare him to that of Shaquille O'Neal, because some of his statistics and some of the things that he was able to do, you had never seen anything quite as dominant like it. But Shaquille O'Neal was not in the era of great centers. He just wasn't. When he started winning, he was not in the same era any longer as a Patrick Ewing or an Akeem Olajuwon or other certain players. When he fought Akeem Olajuwon, when he faced Akeem Olajuwon in that of the 1995 finals, and it was basically mano a mano, Hakeem Olajuwon, he ended up beating him 4-0. They didn't even win one game. Shaquille O'Neal only started winning championships once there was really no other center to really challenge him. Now, the 2000s was an era of great power forwards, like that of Tim Duncan and Chris Webber and Dirk Nowitzki and Kevin Garnett, and, Pau Gasol would come later on, and, other guys like that, but there was no great centers during that time. That's why I compare it a lot to Shaquille O'Neal, because Roger Federer, he was very dominant, and don't get me wrong, he was an all-time great player. And it's not like he never beat Novak Djokovic or never beat Rafael Nadal. He still was able to beat them here and there, but the fact that he has a losing head-to-head record to both of them, and if we are going to debate the Rafael Nadal, debate, he did lose to him at times at Indian Wells, at Wimbledon, and at the Australian Open. So, one could certainly debate that on Rafael Nadal's side. Who would I personally debate is the greater player? One could certainly debate either way. I really don't mind for people who say Roger Federer. But I probably would just ever so slightly put Rafael Nadal over him, just ever so slightly. But some people would, debate different, because, of course, Roger Federer at one point in time, he was looked at as the number one overall player of the world, and so was Rafael Nadal. But I don't know if Rafael Nadal's ever really been legitimately thought of as the best of a generation. But once again, like I said, Roger Federer, when he was, there wasn't a super duper amount of challengers there, so it is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think of the debate and the discussion. That's pretty much about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.